Welcome to Textile Update, the podcast where we can share our passion for textiles, fibers, and yarns. This is Gwendolyn Hustvedt.
This podcast is the second in a short series about protein fibers. Now that we've learned about the properties of protein fibers in general, let's really get into wool, which is actually my favorite fiber. I'm going to be honest with you. I could probably teach an entire class just about wool. I would use wool to talk about the history of civilization. I would use it to talk about genetics. I would use it to talk about culture. I would use it to... We could talk about everything through the framework of wool. I was telling a student the other day, most of my international travel has basically been about, like, can I get to this country because I heard the wool is great there. Now, I'm not saying I love my dogs, okay? My dogs aren't cheap dogs. They're just cute little dogs. I don't know what it'd be like to, have a pet sheep. The sheep I've met have all seemed very nice. The sheep I've eaten have all tasted very nice, right? So, sheep maybe aren't exactly my favorite animal in the whole world, but I love the wool. I love knitting with the wool. I love thinking about the processing of the wool. I love felting the wool. I love spinning the wool into yarn. I just love, love, love wool. Over on my YouTube channel, you're going to find a whole little playlist of videos about wool, short little 4 or 5 minute videos. I had to make a playlist because, I'm in love with wool. All right, so it's kind of hard that I have to basically make wool just one podcast in a whole long series of podcasts about textiles. But I'm going to do that. I understand. We got a lot to talk about here. So first of all, when it comes to the protein fibers, the polymers actually have names, and the name of the polymer, the protein that is makes up wool, is called keratin. It's the same protein that makes up things like hooves and fingernails and stuff like that, right? And actually that's partly why it can be hygroscopic, because that cuticle on the surface of the fiber is actually pretty smooth and hard. You hear about things like keratin hair treatments, which they're still just formaldehyde treatments. They just call them keratin treatments. I don't know, that'd be it's a little redundant and it's a bit deceptive. That's one of the things that's sort of hard once you learn more about textiles and the materials that surround you. There's a lot of people out there that take advantage of the fact that there's very little education in this area to make a lot of claims to get away with stuff. I'm not saying they're bad people, but why they can't just use the truth, right? So you might pick up a bottle of shampoo and it'll say it has keratin in it, like ground up animal hair. I mean, right? It doesn't actually, the polymers in your hair, adding more ground up hair polymers in there doesn't actually change the structure of your hair at all, right? It's going to be definitely more about the chemicals, the other chemicals that are in your hair, not the ground up protein that is in the shampoo, and how those chemicals actually interact with the protein fiber that is your hair, and whether or not they're gentle enough, right? So keratin is the name of the protein that wool is made up of. And because they're made of amino acids, I can't talk about each of all the different amino acids in depth, but I can mention that wool in particular has a lot of amino acids that contain sulfur, right? Amino, right? So all fibers contain carbon. That's set. And then the hydrogen and the oxygen, right? We have hydroxy groups and we have hydrogen ions, right, that are sticking off of these amino acids. And to be an amine group in the first place, it has to have nitrogen. Right? That's a given in amino acids. That's part of their definition. Amine means that it has nitrogen. But not all amino acids have sulfur. And sulfur is a pretty cool molecule because it can form a really stable bond with itself, right? So the disulfide bond, the sulfur to sulfur bond, is a covalent bond which means that the one sulfur needs an electron. The other sulfur, they basically they have like that one electron and they want two. So the one sulfur says, look, I'll give you my electron, and then now you have two, and I am freed of that one odd number, and we can both be happy as long as we stay close to each other. It's like a cute little molecular marriage. So these disulfide bonds can happen between the amino acids in the polymer. This is part of what can drive the 3D crimp, right? Because as the polymers bend back on themselves, or even as the fiber bends back on itself, the polymers can form these very stable disulfide bonds and then retain the kind of kinked shape. This is how a perm works. If you've ever gone into a salon where they're doing, or just in your home where they're doing perms, they're relaxing, right, to straighten it, or perms for curling, the first step is to actually apply a chemical that breaks all of the disulfide bonds. Then you arrange the polymers in the arrangement that you want them to have, whether it's, flat and straight or curled in a different way. And then you allow them to form new sulfur bonds, right, with their now brand new neighbors, by removing the chemical that was preventing them by neutralizing and allowing them to form the new bond. So this is something that the wool in particular has lots of amino acids that can form this. We don't bother to relax wool fibers. We love the fact that they're super crimped. That gives them a lot of cohesiveness. It means we can easily spin yarns using these 3D crimped fibers. And so that's something kind of special about wool that I'm explaining now, because when I talk about silk is missing the sulfur, and so I wanted you to know why having the sulfur is special. The 3D crimp doesn't just influence the cohesion, right? It also influences the bulkiness. The bulkiness means it takes up more space for its weight. And so you can have like a big fluffy sweater that could be really nice. It doesn't wrinkle at all, right? So that's why men, even to this day in the 21st century, will wear wool suiting, because the wool suiting is hygroscopic. It absorbs all of their, flop sweat without making them look damp, helping them feel cool and comfortable because it has nice thermal retention, and they can crumple themselves up in a little, ball at the bottom of the elevator on their way to confront their boss. And when they stand up again, they don't have any wrinkles on their suit, right? I guess I'm picturing kind of a terrible life in a bank somewhere, right? But this wool is their armor, basically, because it prevents people from knowing how terrified they are all the time. It has good stretch, right? So it's very comfortable. You can move, raise your hand and say, I want to buy that, buy, or, right, because it has good elongation. And the hand is soft, right? So, people sometimes say that they're allergic to wool. And in fact, what they're allergic to is the sharp end of cut wool. I want you to think about this just for a minute. When you get your hair cut, right? The fibers, the hair fibers on the back of your neck that fall from your cut hair, they're really scratchy. And that's because they have a very sharp, flat edge where the blade just cut them. And in fact, the long hairs, right, that, if you get your hair cut, the long hairs at the end where your hair was cut, even those, when they touch your skin, will be kind of scratchy, right? So like you're trying to sleep and your hair may scratch you. I put my hair up on top of my head because of that. But, I'm going to use this term. It feels very, it doesn't have to be sexist. There's male virgins too, but virgin hair that's never been cut, so like virgin wool, it has a pointed tip because it hasn't been cut, so it's not blunt. And that pointed little tip, that's what makes lamb's wool so valuable. Yes, it is cut down at the surface where it's sheared away from the surface of the skin, right? But in fact, a lot of the wool in a sheep's fleece has actually just fallen out of the skin. The sheep shed the wool, right? And so it doesn't necessarily have that sharp cut end. And if it's lamb's wool, then so what you do is you have to cut the new hair that's coming in so that you can release the old hair that's like matted on the surface. So then the second time around, pretty much most of the hair will have a blunt end on that sheep because you cut it in the first place. I've sheared sheep with like a big pair of scissors. Like clippers would be faster, but it was the Faroe Islands. We were doing like a primitive, very enjoyable thing, and then afterwards had like sheep for dinner. But that blunt end is what actually scratches people. You aren't allergic to the keratin, right? If that was the case, you'd be allergic to your own fingernails. Okay, it's not causing an immune system response. Your skin is being irritated by scratchy fibers. So chances are you'll really enjoy very, very soft, fine wool, wool that is so thin that even if it was cut, that blunt edge just isn't very big. Okay, so don't just give up on all wool just because you had a bad experience with one very thick, coarse, lower quality wool fiber. And actually, the surface of the wool, we call it the epicuticle. Epi meaning like on the outside, like epidermis is on the outside. The epicuticle is a greasy substance called lanolin. I have a sweater up there. That one I'm pointing to, that one came from Ireland. It's an Aran sweater. And it still has a bit of grease on it. That's what makes it such a nice sweater for outdoors, because so when I sniff it, I can smell kind of a woolly smell. The surface is a little bit greasy. That actually also sort of reduces that scratchy feeling. That sweater there from the Faroe Islands, right? Still has quite a bit of lanolin on it. That helps to make it almost waterproof, right? And that's a great feature in parts of the world like Ireland or the Faroes where it rains every day. But that lanolin, in some cases, when we process wool, the wool will lose about half of its weight. We call it greasy wool when it has a lot of lanolin on it. It'll lose about half of its weight in lanolin. We actually collect the lanolin, depending on where it's processed, of course. Some places they don't have the ability to collect the lanolin, but in many places, a lot of wool processing is now done in China. And that's partly because it has an environmental impact, right? It uses a lot of water, and the water is now full of soap and grease. And so, for example, we used to have a scouring, a wool processing facility here in San Marcos, right there by Spring Lake. An older faculty member who's since retired, her home is right there, and she talked about just how it would smell like rancid lanolin during scouring season. And a lot of neighborhoods don't want that anymore, right? So, but wherever it's processed, we save the lanolin and then use it in cosmetic materials. So now here's the irony. You can actually be allergic to lanolin. If you've ever had a problem of you may be one of these people, like you're using a lip balm and you're like, man, this lip balm, I swear I'm addicted to it or something because like it's just making my lips more chapped, right? Look at the ingredients. If you've ever had a situation where you could like, that's so funny. My watch just interrupted me. Please be quiet, watch, or I'll take you off. If you've ever had a situation where you're using a lip balm and you can like peel layers of skin off your lip, check the list of ingredients. If lanolin is in the list of ingredients, there's some lipsticks that have lanolin as well, then it's possible that you're allergic to lanolin. And the peeling is because what the lanolin does is for some people, it actually stimulates your skin to form a new layer. So you shed the old layer of skin and form a new one. And it's kind of itchy while you're shedding your skin. Gross, right? I'm allergic to lanolin. So like after I sheared all those sheep in the Faroe Islands, on the way home, my hands started to itch, and then I was able to just peel layers of skin off. Oh, I'm so sorry. That's just gross, right? But I actually read the ingredients on the lipsticks. I'm careful not to use cosmetic products with lanolin in it because, in fact, I do have an actual response. It is a type of allergy. So it may be not so much that you're allergic to wool, like, ooh, it's scratchy. You might be allergic to lanolin, like, ooh, my skin is peeling off. Speaking of peeling off, let's talk about the scales. Under that lanolin, the wool, the cuticle, which is what we call the surface of the wool, right? Think about the cuticle in your fingernail, right? There's your fingernail, and the cuticle overlaps it. The cuticle and the wool are these scales that overlap each other. When the wool fiber is moist, it swells, right? All that extra water inside, and the cuticles can open up So they sort of stick up, right? And that means that it's easier to felt at that point, which is what happens when the cuticles tangle with each other. It means that the fiber is more vulnerable to breaking, right? So that's another reason not to brush your hair when it's wet, right? But then when it resettles down to it's about 18% moisture content, those scales lay flat and they ratchet in just one direction, but in that one direction, the surface of the fiber feels very smooth. Now, inside the wool fiber itself, and I'm telling you now, I know all this because back in the day, like years ago, I took this same class. I was a grad student and I took textiles, which was the freshman level class. And the only reason it's actually, quote, freshman level is because we know that none of you have ever studied this before, right? And so even though it's pretty complicated and very rich and deep, it's the introductory introduction to a whole new area. So I'm just explaining why colleges treat this very complex science as an introductory course. So back in the day, I had to write an extra paper to get grad credit for the class. I read a paper on advancements in the morphology of wool. Was the title of the paper, because I was so into like what we had learned about the structure of the wool fiber using scanning electron microscopes. So we were able to understand even more about what's happening inside the wool fibers. It turns out that some of the polymers twist in one direction in one half of the fiber, and that they twist in the other direction in the other half of the fiber. And so it's like let's go right. No, let's go left. Let's go right. Let's go left. And like the fighting between the two halves of the fiber also contributes to the crimp. I mean, that is so cool. And what we learned when we studied that is that if you had slightly different chemical makeup between the two halves of a fiber, you could actually build crimp into manufactured fibers as well. So we study natural fibers to learn how to make synthetic fibers more like natural fibers. In the very, very middle of the wool fiber is where the vein was originally when the fiber was being fed, like back in its tiny little infancy, when it was still attached to the scalp of the animal, and it was there's a spot right down in the I'm forgetting the name of it now, right? But it's the part that's still attached in the scalp. That's the part, like on CSI, they're looking for it because if they find that it's got DNA in it. Still not happening, but at any rate, in that part, there's this little hollow center will be created because that's where the blood was feeding the little fiber as it was being built. All of the protein was being delivered to the enzymes that were actually making the fiber as it was growing. If you cut a wool fiber along the cross section, you'll see that it's round, but its surface contour is covered with scales, right? So round would say, ooh, shiny, right? But then surface contour says, no, distraction, right? Bumpy surface, breaking up light rays. So not shiny, right? The wool is not a fiber that we think of as being shiny. As I said, I have a whole video about felting, but I can just explain briefly, right, that the cuticles all point in one direction, these little scales, which act as a type of ratchet. So the fiber slides smoothly in the direction that the scales are originating, right? But if you try to pull the fiber back, right, then the edge of the scale where it sticks up will catch against the surface of other fibers. And that means that all the fibers can only travel in one direction. You get them hot and warm, the fibers swell open and the scales stick out even further, exacerbating that ratcheting effect. So a little moisture, a little agitation, you can actually rub the fiber to tangle it up. It gets smaller because the fibers are basically sliding in one direction, getting closer and closer to each other, right? And so all the extra air space has been basically tangled out of the material. But you can actually make textiles just by entangling the wool fibers, allowing the scales to really make a tangled mess. And so you need heat, moisture, and agitation, which is exactly what's happening in most washing machines. We can do some things, some finishes, which we'll talk a lot more about a lot of finishes later, but I like to introduce a few finishes for each of the natural fibers now, just to help you get excited about the idea of finishes. None of the finishes improve anything about the surface of the fibers except for dimensional stability. So they don't make them shinier, right? Picture a chicken. You pluck off all its feathers. It's not got a bumpy surface. You remove the scales. You don't like make the surface shiny. You just make bumps where the scales used to attach. Okay. So it's not like it suddenly becomes lustrous. It's now just kind of naked and bumpy, right? So luster doesn't happen. It doesn't get any stronger, right? We've in many cases used bleach to remove the scales. Okay. Bleached hair isn't stronger. Bleached fibers aren't stronger either. So it doesn't get any shinier, it doesn't get any stronger, it doesn't get softer, right? Bleached hair certainly isn't soft. Even if we use like a nylon coating to basically glue the scales down, it doesn't change the fact that they still break up the light. They're there under that nylon. And the nylon isn't like actually nice to touch, right? So all that happens when we apply a washable wool finish to wool is we make it have dimensional stability. That's all that happens. It doesn't get better in any other area except for that one area. I just want to clear that up because a lot of people are like, well, then why don't we do that to everything? Well, sometimes it's worth it to leave the fiber alone and then just launder it very carefully or dry clean it. If you make it, quote, washable, you've degraded it in a permanent way. All right, so now that we've talked about the external morphology of the wool, I want to take us along the process here. We have the hair, this wool that's on the surface of the sheep, right? The weather gets hot, right? And the sheep shed the hair. But because the hair can tangle easily, it forms sort of a mat on the surface of the hair. So when we're shearing the sheep, what we're doing is we're actually giving them a haircut on the hair that's still growing out of their skin. But that hair, coated by lanolin, is not the hair that's actually tangled. I mean, it is part of the fleece, but it's not the majority of the fleece. So this is my experience shearing a sheep, right? You stick your hand in there and kind of lift up, and this whole big mat of hair that's sitting on the top of your hand lifts up. And then, in theory, if you just kind of lift it far enough, you could actually just kind of slide that mat right off. And that's what happens in the wild, right? Big chunks of the fleece will fall off, right? It just slides right off of the other hair, right? Because it's like they shed their hair only as a big mat. But if we want to get it all off in one big piece, we'll go in and we'll cut the hair that's holding it, right? The still growing hair that's holding it, creating that blunt end, right, on those hairs that next time will be a tiny bit scratchy. The summer I was in the Faroes shearing, because of the global warming, because of the change in the temperature of the ocean, they're actually not having the same high temperatures that they normally have in the summer. It's kind of a weird counter effect, right? So the whole planet's temperature is going up, but like in microclimates like theirs, actually the temperature has gone down, and if the jet stream, quote, slips, right, they could end up having an uninhabitable island. So we had to exfoliate quite a bit of their hair. Not enough of the hair had come out yet or shed, so that when we were pulling on their hair to try and shear it, we really couldn't. We were pulling hair out of the sheep's skin, actually. So exfoliating is like waxing, kind of. You felt bad. You had to get it pulled up far enough, right? So you had to pull out just enough hair that you could get the scissors in there and cut the rest of it, right? But the poor sheep, because it hurt, right? But we're just trying to get the old fleece off of them because they would be really hot and uncomfortable to have this old fleece on them. So we just had to kind of keep a good handle on the sheep, and exfoliating is what they do to remove the wool from a sheep that's been slaughtered, for example, because at that point it's not going to object. Objecting is over. And then in the shed there in the Faroe Islands, we graded and sorted the wool, right? So if the fleece felt really nice while we were shearing it, we threw it in one pile. If it felt old and scratchy, we threw it in a different pile, the pile that felt nice. A buyer would stop by and pick it up to make into nice sweaters. They call them jumpers. And the wool that didn't feel nice would be taken to the incineration plant and burned. And then they would use the heat from the incineration plant to scour it, basically really hot soapy water to remove all of that grease. And then we card the fibers using big, like dog brushes kind of. They've got like bent wire bristles, right? And carding is the old-fashioned name, but it's a brush, right? So you want to think carding like, oh, you're brushing. And actually the difference between a carded fiber and a combed fiber, I want you to think about like the difference between, picture somebody with really curly hair. If you brush their hair gets really big and fluffy, right? And so if you want a really big fluffy yarn, you brush it using the card. It takes out all of the tangles, helps remove extra, like leaves and dirt and stuff like that, right? That might have been trapped in there, removes the tangles, but it's really fluffy and it's used to make big, fluffy, bulky sweaters, right? And we call those big, fluffy yarns woolen. So carded yarns are woolen because they're big and thick and woolly. But if we want to make a fabric that is where all of that extra, if you comb really fluffy hair, right, you can smooth it down and kind of remove some of that extra air from in there and make it as smooth as possible and get it really nice and tight, like you're getting ready to braid it, right? You can make it pretty small. You can twist it pretty hard, right? And then the surface will become shinier. It will become smoother. It's not as fluffy. So carding is like brushing, nice and big and fluffy, and makes what we call woolen yarns. And then if we comb it, right, we further align the fibers, tighten them up, and we make what we call worsted yarns. And worsted is bested, right? That's how I try to remember it. Like, so worsted yarns make the best suits, right? And it's because we combed the fibers after we carded them. And you can do this by hand, but of course it's also done by big machines for the big money. So if you have a swatch kit, look through your swatch kit. You'll find examples of yarns that are pointed out as being combed or carded. That would be what the language we use for cotton fibers, right? Combed or carded, or they might be listed as woolen or worsted yarns. And that's what we call it for the woolen, because not just because W starts with W, like woolen and worsted starts with W, but that's how I remember them. I promised that I would mention a couple of finishes. So I've already talked about felt resistance, right, which improves dimensional stability. But I also want to mention fulling. So after we've made yarn and we weave or knit the woolen or worsted yarns into the various types of fabric that we can make out of wool. If we're making a woven woolen fabric, we can do a process called fulling. And people whose last name are Fuller are actually people who fold for a living. I saw a presentation at a textile history conference in December, actually, where somebody made some fulled wool because they were trying to figure out how to replicate military uniforms or garments from kind of the Revolutionary War era. And so people would weave the wool themselves, but then they would take it to a person called a fuller that had a machine that kind of pounded the wool to make it to make the surface tighter. So this historian had found some different descriptions of mechanics, and she used her washing machine, right? And what she found was an accounts book where a fuller was noting how much the wool weighed when the customer gave it to him, and how big it was, and then how much smaller it was after they were done fulling it. So she could estimate like the percent reduction in length, right? And so she was trying to see like how long it took to get the fabric to be that much tighter. I should explain what fulling is. So fulling is when we tighten up the weave by it's basically controlled felting. So it's like would be a loose, open, coarse weave, but then we can use hot water and agitation to tighten the fabric. It felts just a tiny bit, and then this newly fulled fabric is a little bit more waterproof. It's the wind doesn't whistle through it as well, right? The surface will be a little bit tighter, right? And actually, I don't know if you've ever watched that particular episode of Outlander. It's a series on, I think, the Starz channel. And in this particular episode, the character is like a World War II nurse who's traveled back in time mysteriously, and it's romantic hijinks ensue. And so there she is in like whatever century Scotland, I can't remember at the moment, but primitive wool producing culture. And she's like hanging out with the other ladies, like they're having like a chick afternoon, and it involves fulling wool. So they've got a big wooden table and they've got pieces of wool and they're actually fulling it using their hands, right? So the agitation is them like slamming the wool down against the table, scrubbing it towards each other and then pulling it away, right? And the moisture is provided by the fact that the wool is wet. Passing around a flask, everybody's drinking the whiskey, having a good old time. At a certain point, she's like, wow, I've drank so much whiskey, I gotta pee. Goes into a tent, or it's like to go over to, relieve herself, and they run over with a bucket, and they're like, do it here. And she's like, okay, that's handy, you got a bucket for me. This is like a great festival I'm at, right? Then they take the bucket with the warm, and splash it down the table. In fact, there's chemicals in urine that were useful for fulling. So if your last name's Fuller, at any rate, that's what she discovered through time traveling. So yes, fulling tightens up the weave in a wool fabric, and so that's one finish that is pretty standard for wool. So that is the story of wool. Next time we'll talk about other specialty fibers that come from animals.